Hello everybody, a warm welcome to you. My name is Denis Schrey. I'm the host of today's discussion with our estimated colleague Jakob Wöllenstein, who is the country representative of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in Minsk, based in Vilnius. And I'm very much looking forward, Jakob, to talk to you about the situation in Minsk and in Belarus. We are very interested to get a sense and an idea on the political climate in the country at the moment.
Hello and good morning from Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Belarus office in Vilnius. It's a pleasure to be on this format. So the political climate in the country and the mood which you asked about, I think it's important to take a short look back at last month, where we saw a widespread euphoria between and among those people in civil society who went to those demonstrations, who took part in all the broad protest actions. And even in that time, there were a lot of surveys that were made for these people who took part in the protests to get an impression of how they feel. And the mood went between euphoria on the weekends to resignation and depression, say on Wednesday. And then when it came towards these weekends with the huge upcoming protest actions, people were then re-energized. I would even say this is like a mental petrol station to get energy before then being thrown back into reality, where the government was putting ever more effort and energy in suppressing those protests. And what we've seen now over the last weeks, since December 27th, there were no coordinated protest actions. The big Telegram channels, which used to call people for action, ceased doing this. The protests are much more decentralized, and the movement, which has always been grassroots, has become even more grassroots over these last weeks. The first call for united action was actually on January 23rd, when we also saw the protests in Russia. But in the meantime, in between, people were self-organizing these. And this very much relates into the mood. People say it goes between resignation, continued resistance, and silent or even outspoken hopes for this new spring to come. Right now, over the last weeks, people took a break. On the one hand, needing to re-energize, to be home for the holidays. Also, it was very cold. It was minus 20 degrees for some time. And COVID is also very much spreading through Belarus. There was a statistics in December saying that 1 in 4 tests that was taken was positive. So there was a big impact as well, why people took a break and a pause from these big concentrated actions. And the state very much beefed up its repressions. The penal code, for example, was tightened, and the code for administrative offensive, for example, for breaking the law in unauthorized gatherings, there's 4 times higher penalties now for this, and going to prison for 2 times longer. So all this repression also contributed to this overall mood. But people say they are hoping now for the springtime, when the snow melts, that also the protest actions will come back. And the question is now, will there be a trigger? What will be a trigger to re-energize the protest movement?
Thank you very much. And this is really interesting to get a sense of the circumstances in which the demonstrations and opposition are currently taking place. Of course, we have the corona pandemic, which probably also affected Belarus. We have the winter coming, and it's really interesting to better understand the current political and also economic circumstances in the country. You mentioned that the authoritarian regime is also trying to stifle a little bit harder through, let's say, more restrictive laws and regulations. What do you think about the action of the European Council, which recently imposed restrictive measures against 40 individuals identified as responsible for repression and intimidation against peaceful demonstrators, opposition members and journalists, and so on? So how effective are, in your opinion, such measures at a time when Russia and China are backing the current government?
This is a question which obviously has been concerning us a lot over the last month. And it always comes back to this basic questions: what is the sense and the effectiveness of sanctions at all? And if you listen to Belarusian officials, regime representatives, they will tell you, well, we've had all these sanctions, they come and go, and this is just another round of the same game. We will wait for some time, and then it will be business as usual and back to normal. It is fair to say that sanctions are both demonized on one side, saying that this is completely destructive, and on the other side, you see overarching hopes that sanctions will immediately change the situation. Sanctions very much also show that in foreign policy, there is a very limited number of instruments that can be applied to use pressure on the one hand, trying and hoping to change something, but also on the other side to say that you profoundly disagree with something. So it is a predicament for policymakers what kind of sanctions you choose. If you choose to take them, if you don't choose to have sanctions, people will say, how is the European Union so inactive? How can he not react to this? And on the other hand, if they react, you will always face criticism, like we saw on the last package, the third sanction package, that people said, both the regime, obviously, they said sanctions are wrong completely. And even people in the democracy movement were very much disappointed, saying they should have gone much, much further. It took us several months to even reach the same level of sanctions against individuals, which we had in 2011 after the last big crackdown against a democratic election. And now the question is, if you have these individual sanctions against business people, against people in the regime around Lukashenko, and you have asset freeze in the European Union and you ban them from entering, is this actually going to change something? And I think in the short run, it obviously will not change something, because those people, they see their power is threatened very much thoroughly through the democracy movement, and in their priorities, not traveling to France or to Lithuania is very much less important than prevailing at home and winning and keeping power. So this is not going to change something, but it's important, first of all, as a symbol. The second question is, which has been touched upon now with this third sanction package, do you actually also target businesses? I think here we come to a different point where it gets more interesting, although the list which we've seen so far has been also perceived as being rather symbolic by most Belarusians. They say that the real pockets, they say, of the regime where they have money channels through the European Union, they have not really been touched. And that even in the last moment, that's what we heard, individuals that were identified were taken off this list. So I think this will be a question for continued dialogue, what to do about sanctions, what businesses to target, maybe even which products to target. We've seen this. And this, I think, shows that sanctions are not ineffective, that some businessmen in the surrounding of Lukashenko are now even already re-registering their businesses to family members and friends, because they are afraid that they might end up on the next sanctions list. So if they're afraid and take these steps, it means it can hurt them. But we should not expect for this to change the situation in a matter of a short time. The second question is, you mentioned Russia and China, and I think this alludes to maybe the most vulnerable spot, because the Belarusian government is looking for ways to refund. They have high state debt, which even rose over the last year. This is a side effect of the Western sanctions, that it will be very difficult for them to refinance their debt. And they only have, the Eastern neighbors, the Eurasian Development Bank, the Russian Federation, and also China and maybe some Arab countries to turn to. And we've seen so far the support coming from Russia, which was 1.5 billion in credits, was not very, very generous. So it was rather refinancing of existing debts to prolong those debts and refinance and restructure them. But it is not really giving a lot of money to stabilize Lukashenko beyond the absolute need to stabilize the system.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive answer. I also, just to come back on sanctions, I very much agree that you can always doubt the impact political sanctions have. Here at the European level, we have a discussion now on the Magnitsky Act, which is extended legislation for also asset freeze and business sanctions. So there is a discussion in Europe ongoing to better coordinate with other stakeholders, the US and Great Britain, to have a more coordinated approach on this, because we all know that still, if you have sanctions for or on businesses, it might affect those who are in the government, who profit from their business relations. And so therefore, I think it's still an ongoing discussion here at the European level to be more coordinated with other actors who already have a rather strict sanction regime. I don't say that this is always positive or always effective, but it seems that, for example, the US, they have a much stricter regime in place. And probably most of the assets of the Belarusian leaders are not in the US, but nevertheless, we have this discussion here in Brussels, and we see it picking up now. And we are also interested to see on the new legislation, which will probably come out by the middle of this year.
Yeah, if I can add something to this, I think it's interesting to also compare the sanctions lists. There is a huge overlap between the sanctions list of the UK, of Canada, of the US, although those sanctions lists were shorter, but had Alexander Lukashenko himself earlier on the list than the European Union sanctions did. I think one interesting aspect of this renewed democracy, a Belarus Democracy Act that the United States have passed late in December, is that they also considered sanctioning individuals in Russia who support Belarus. I think this is interesting because what we've seen is that a lot, as we already said, depends on the support from the Russian Federation, from business individuals, from the government, and including them, I think, is a smart aspect. One more thing, which is important when talking about sanctions, is this effect of naming and shaming. What we've seen over the last weeks and months when talking to decision makers in Brussels, but also people from Belarusian society who are working in preparing lists for sanctions, is that they're often struggling to have evidence which can be used in court. So at the end of the day, very often decision makers struggle to put people on the list if they don't see the necessary proof, although there's a high probability and very good indicators that they should be on those lists according to the standards the lists say. The real proof to find this that works in court is difficult. But having naming and shaming, and there are initiatives in the Belarusian democracy movement who list all those policemen, for example, who use violence against demonstrators in the climate when there was open guarantees of amnesty for them. So Lukashenko himself told his security guards, just do whatever you please in order to make sure you secure the stability of the government. And when they use violence under these circumstances, it's their individual choice. So listing these police officers, for example, and having those compiled lists, I think naming and shaming is important, because if they know that their actions go noticed, the probability for them to be prosecuted in the future is much higher.
Thank you very much. Just to come back on the situation of the mobilization of the opposition, we saw that the authorities, they took a stronger stance and used more and more violence against protesters. And it seemed at least to have a negative effect on mobilization of the opposition in Belarus. So you mentioned at the beginning that there are different reasons for it, why there is less mobilization at the moment. But can you tell us a little bit more about the current reciprocal tactics of the government and the opposition to gain political ground?
It seems like the main tactics of Lukashenko has become to have a demobilization. So not to give people reasons to go out. First of all, by not giving this trigger, I mentioned this, I think it's very important in the next weeks and months. We'll decide upon the return, a spring comeback, which people say, of the democracy movement and the protests, which will depend on a trigger. He's trying to draw the process to drag it on for a long time. What he says recently is that this constitutional reform, which everybody was waiting for, which also the Russians seem to have embraced as the solution out of the crisis, will not be a matter of months, but rather something of years. He said that there will be a new draft of the constitution ready by the end of the year, which then will be discussed over some time, and then there will be a referendum at some point, and after this, there will be new elections, which could well be, according to his understanding, Lukashenko's understanding, at the end of his current term. So not giving people triggers, while at the same time being brutal about crushing the last bits of protests. So there was never complete seeds of action. It was, as I said, decentralized. Rather than having these Sunday rallies, people would rather take to the streets in smaller formats on different days. So it's this cat and mouse game between the police or the security forces and those groups of people. But he's trying to smash this to show also to the Russians, inter alia, that he is in charge. The people have been turning to more creative tactics to keep the spirit running. I think it's important also the symbolism. There is this ongoing fight about symbols in the public sphere. You know that the protest movement is using the historic flag, white, red, and white, and those symbols of the old Belarus. And the authorities are currently working on removing them. And even using a very broad interpretation of the penal code and administrative offenses code, even entering people's homes to take off flags from their balconies. But then at night, people will go out and paint them on walls, on streets, in the ice. There were absurd pictures of security people fighting against snowmen who were built up at night with those flags. So this is I think, an important part. And then on the other hand, for all the initiatives working on documentation of the crimes on one side and preparing for campaigns to come out, to have this important notion of the feeling, the understanding that the people who are for changes, who are in favor of this, are the majority. Keeping this sentiment, I think, will be extremely crucial. One initiative, for example, is since Lukashenko is coming up with this big all Belarusian People's Congress in a few weeks on the 11th of February, he will host this convention of 2,500 people, which meets once in 5 years to discuss and decide upon the next 5 years socio-economic development plans. Lukashenko will have this meeting with people who support him, basically. The democracy movement wants to recreate this kind of meeting, but they say we want to have a real representation of people. So they create an app to gather people to take decisions, like a counter meeting for this. So there's several initiatives and ideas to keep mobilization going, but it's especially important to have this understanding that they're still the majority, even though they don't take to the streets in the hundreds of thousands in the city center of Minsk.
Thank you for this further elaboration, Jakob. For me, it would be interesting to understand how the current government is actually together. So on this, are there voices within the Lukashenko regime that are open for a national dialogue, including opposition forces? Are there voices within the Belarusian government which are really interested and have a genuine interest to open up? Do these voices have a chance not to win, but to influence Lukashenko in the future? Is this basically polarization that we are currently observing? Will it continue? Is there a chance that more reform-oriented voices within the government take more ground? Or is this illusion?
Well, this was the big question that everybody was asking themselves in the first half of last year, facing the elections. Since 2015, there was a period of liberalization. And Lukashenko even appointed a reform government himself just 2 years ago with much younger faces, people in their mid-40s, who would come up with interesting reform agenda to push the country forward. And what we saw in Belarus over the last years were these islands of freedom. So legislation, for example, for the IT sector, that was much, much more liberal than the very much regulated economy, which is dominated by the state. State-owned enterprises, were islands of freedom in the cultural sphere. So all this were the conditions in which the protest movement arose last year. But Lukashenko took care of this himself to remove those reform voices. So even before the elections, he removed his liberal government and replaced them with people which mostly come from the security apparatus. Ever since there were several more changes where he would replace incumbents with people that are even closer to him and more loyal, and they execute his will. What we saw after the violence and the crackdown in August was that quite a considerable number of people, of public servants left, especially in the fields of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so diplomats, who had been building this more positive image of Belarus over the last years, and now saw all this being thrown away in a matter of days. And in the media sphere, so many people, journalists from the state media resigned very quickly. And now the question is, those who stayed, do they all emotionally support Lukashenko's cause at the moment? And I think this, it's hard to answer on the individual cases. You can't look into somebody's head, whether they choose to stay where they are in order to prevent worse events or whether they fully support. But I think the people in the system now are very, very careful, knowing that if you speak up at this moment, when Lukashenko, on the one hand, seems to think he has already won, but on the other hand, knows how vulnerable everything was over the last month, and things could change and come back over the next weeks, depending again on triggers. People are very, very careful to speak up. I've heard from public servants, even not the lowest ranking, that they would be willing basically to talk, but that is completely off the table to have any kind of dialogue. And Lukashenko himself, I think, had the climax of any kind of dialogue in October, when he met with political prisoners for the first and I think the only time at all in this KGB prison in Minsk. So he had this roundtable for hours and he was talking to his opponents, for the first time considering that people actually are political prisoners, because you don't go to the prison to talk to people about politics if they are not there for political reasons. But ever since there were a few releases, people were put onto house arrest and they were trying to imitate some kind of dialogue. But I don't think he sees any reason to have this dialogue. Nobody besides him will be able to conduct this dialogue, because Lukashenko has built up a very unique power vertical. So he actually controls things and he calls the shots. So people who have initiatives that go in a different direction will be stopped at some point, or they will be ineffective. And so he would not engage in any kind of dialogue, because it would mean at this point giving in to demands that he doesn't seem to want to give in. And the question would be what to talk about. Any dialogue with the democracy movement would come to the point where they say, well, release the political prisoners. He refuses to do this. There might be some considerations or concessions on that point at some point, but not at the moment. When people like Victor Babariko, who was his main opponent, according to polls would be the favored candidate by a huge group of people for the next presidential election. So releasing him could be this trigger that mobilizes. Ceding on violence, he wouldn't do this because he wants to win completely. And having new elections, according to any other plan than himself, is not something which he's considering. And stepping down, I think, is out of question for him. He doesn't see the need to conduct any dialogue, but rather will have this Belarusian People's Congress, which I mentioned, this convention in 2 weeks. And he will say, well, this is the dialogue. These are the people. They represent the people of Belarus, and I talk to them. So there you go. Everything else is fake.
Jakob, just a final question. As we are based here in Brussels with the European institutions, and we have talked already the difficulty the European Union had to put sanctions together. There was not much coherence on the EU approach. What would be, for the future relations between the EU and Belarus, what would be your recommendations for the European foreign policy to engage with the country and with the different opposition forces?
Well, I think it will make sense to continue taking a close look at the recommendations for those sanctions lists. So sticks and carrots, I think, is important in order to have both sides, and to listen to the Belarusians themselves, in order not to reproduce the effect which we saw for this third package of sanctions, where again, the reaction which we saw from Belarus was rather disappointed. One analyst even said the only one who suffers from this kind of sanctions package is the reputation of the European Union in Belarus, because it feels to us that the European Union is putting their own business interest before the interest of defending democracy. But I think what speaks louder than sanctions is support. And the European Union is better at supporting, of coming up with those programs to help victims of repression, to have programs that support civil society, those in exile, but as much as possible those in the country, to loudly speak about economic support. Because whatever the outcome of this crisis, how long it will take, Belarus will need substantial assistance in the economic sphere and in the relations, to build up good business relations with Belarus. And we should consider that Belarus has a lot to offer in many, many spheres. The IT sector is just one of them, but also I think ecotourism will be a big thing in the future, hopefully sooner than later. The country has a good potential in human resources, in several other fields of the industry. So considering economic cooperation is important, and not stepping into the geopolitical trap in the communication, I think, is still important. Not to feed the propaganda that says that the West wants to drag Belarus into its camp, but this is the sovereign choice of Belarusians. But to say, when we criticize things, it's about democracy, about the rule of law, not about geopolitical games. I think this is extremely important. And when there are signs from the Belarusian authority that they want to engage in a dialogue, which again, I don't see at this moment, those chances should also be taken very much. And not saying that we refuse to talk to them. This, I think, would be the wrong way, but use existing channels to the country, also to the regime. If they're willing to talk, then we should definitely do this.
Thank you very much for this really interesting background information on your country, on the relations of Belarus with the European Union. And I wish you really all the best for your work, for your dialogues, and also for your political work in the country. Please stay tuned with our podcast series. We are looking forward to our next speaker, which will come from Uganda. And for now, stay tuned and all the best.
Thank you, Dennis.
Remember to follow us on our social media channels. You can find all the links in the description.